Philadelphia, August 12th, 2005. The city pulsed like a living organism. Neon signs flickered, car horns echoed down South Street, and humid night air clung to every passerby. It was a place where life never seemed to slow, where music and voices blurred into one restless soundtrack. At 11:30 p.m., 26-year-old Lily Grace Hill stepped out of the South Street diner after a long shift. She waved to her coworkers, her canvas bag slung across one shoulder, her faded blue shirt damp from the summer heat. To anyone watching, she looked like just another young woman heading home after work. But to those who knew her, Lily was careful, predictable, steady. She always took the same route. The Girard Avenue bus stop was her ritual, her lifeline back to Fishtown. By 11:45, a taxi driver saw her under the dim yellow halo of a street lamp. Petite, brown hair tied back, clutching her bag close. In that fleeting moment, she stood out, a lone figure in the city's restless glow. And then, she was gone. No one saw her board the bus. No one heard her scream. No camera captured her walking away. 20 minutes. That was all it took for Lily to vanish. Now, imagine yourself there. You're walking alone on that sweltering street, the kind where shadows linger in alleys and every footstep behind you makes your heart race. Would you notice the stranger watching from across the road? Would you recognize danger before it swallowed you whole? For Lily, the answer came too late. Her disappearance became one of Philadelphia's most haunting mysteries, filed away among countless cold case files. But years later, science would unearth the truth and reveal the face of the man who thought he had escaped forever. Stay with us, and before we dive deeper, take just 3 seconds to subscribe. This channel brings forgotten cold case files back to life, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Lily Grace Hill was not the kind of person who invited trouble. Friends described her as careful, steady, the sort of young woman who found comfort in routines. She was 26 years old, working at the South Street Diner for nearly 2 years, and though she didn't earn much, she lived with quiet pride in what she had built. Her coworkers often joked that she was the most dependable person they knew. If Lily said she'd cover your shift, she'd show up. If she promised she'd call, she always did. Her lifestyle was simple, almost predictable. Each night after work, she cleaned the counters, tied back her brown hair, collected her canvas bag, and set off for the Girard Avenue bus stop. It was a 10 to 12-minute walk through streets that could be loud and chaotic, sometimes unnerving. Her family had begged her to reconsider, warning that South Street at night was no place for a young woman alone. But Lily dismissed those concerns. "I'm used to it," she told them. "It's fine. I know the way." Eights. That insistence, the small stubbornness in her voice, carried the weight of someone who didn't want to live in fear. But in hindsight, that very determination to stick with her routine would become a tragic thread in her story. On the night of August 12th, 2005, Philadelphia was stifling even after the sun had set. Heat radiated off the asphalt like an invisible fire. By 11:30 p.m., when Lily waved goodbye to her coworkers and stepped outside, the city still felt like a furnace. She wore her usual faded light blue shirt, jeans worn thin at the knees, and white sneakers long past their prime. Slung across her shoulder was the old canvas bag everyone knew as her lucky bag. Inside were only modest belongings. Her Motorola flip phone, a wallet with a few crumpled bills, a notebook filled with recipes she wanted to try one day. Ordinary things for an ordinary young woman. She turned right from the diner, walking toward Girard Avenue. The sidewalks were quieter than earlier, the rush of the dinner crowd replaced with scattered groups leaving bars. A neon sign buzzed overhead. A faint trace of grease and cigarette smoke lingered in the air. By 11:45 p.m. Just 15 minutes later, a taxi driver passing by recalled seeing her standing beneath a street lamp near the bus stop. She looked small under the yellow glow, shoulders squared, eyes alert, clutching her bag as though it were a shield. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it would later become the last confirmed sighting of Lily Grace Hill alive. The bus that she normally caught came and went. The driver had no memory of her boarding. Passengers said they saw no young woman in a blue shirt and jeans. And by midnight, it was as if Lily had been erased from the city streets. You look at this timeline and realize 20 minutes is enough to erase someone from the map. From the diner to the bus stop, the walk should have been uneventful, just another routine passage through the city. But something in that brief window went terribly wrong. Investigators later reconstructed those minutes with meticulous care, but at the time, for her family and friends, it was pure confusion. Where had she gone? Who might have crossed her path? Psychologically, Lily's decision to keep her routine reflected both her independence and her vulnerability. She trusted the familiarity of the walk, the comfort of repetition. For her, the Girard Avenue bus stop wasn't a danger zone. It was simply the end of another day. She had grown numb to her family's warnings, the way many of us do when advice feels repetitive. And yet, her insistence on being used to it reveals something deeper. She didn't believe bad things happened to people like her. That quiet, everyday confidence made her human, and tragically, it made her unprepared for the possibility of real danger. Her disappearance in those 20 minutes exposed just how fragile routine can be. For the Hill family, the first hours after realizing Lily hadn't come home were filled with denial. Maybe she had stayed with a friend. Maybe she'd lost track of time. But as dawn broke and her bed remained untouched, denial gave way to dread. Her phone sat powerless on the table, its battery drained. The canvas bag she never parted with was missing too. Police were called within hours. The missing person report went out. Detectives from Philadelphia's Special Victims Unit began piecing together Lily's last known movements. They interviewed co-workers at the diner. Everyone confirmed she left at 11:30 sharp, smiling politely as she walked out the door. They canvassed the Girard Avenue area. The taxi driver's statement about seeing her at 11:45 became the anchor of the investigation. But beyond that moment, silence. The psychological weight of those 20 minutes is impossible to ignore. Think of it. In a city of more than 1.5 million people, with cars rushing by, music playing, and lights flashing, a young woman could vanish without a trace. It wasn't an empty highway or a remote forest. It was Philadelphia, buzzing with life. And yet, the crowd, the noise, the chaos, all of it seemed to conspire in creating cover for something unspeakable. Lily's personality painted a painful contrast. She was meticulous, kind, and dependable. She had dreams of finishing culinary school one day, using that notebook of recipes she carried everywhere. Friends said she laughed easily, but was cautious around strangers. That night, however, caution was not enough. Her predictability, the same routine repeated night after night, made her movements easy to anticipate. If anyone had been watching her, and later evidence suggested someone was, they would have known exactly where she would be and when. For her mother, Linda Hill, the guilt was unbearable. She replayed conversations where she warned Lily, urging her to call for a ride, to avoid walking alone so late. But Lily always brushed it off, insisting she could handle it. That mother's intuition, the instinct that something was wrong, haunted Linda after her daughter vanished. Parents often fear being overprotective, but Linda's words proved tragically prophetic. As the hours stretched into days, the timeline only grew more chilling. Police noted her last definite appearance at 11:45, standing at the bus stop. The next bus arrived at 11:50, but she wasn't on it. Her phone signal cut off almost exactly at that time. The gap between 11:30 and 11:50 became the focal point of the entire case. Every possible scenario hinged on those 20 minutes. Neighbors living near Girard Avenue recalled hearing nothing unusual, no screams, no struggle. One woman said she saw a tall man speaking with a young woman at the stop, but her description was vague. Without clear surveillance footage, there was little for investigators to act on. The SEPTA bus cameras that should have captured Lily's presence were malfunctioning that night, leaving only a blurry frame that might have been her. It was as if the city itself had conspired to erase her. For the viewer, it's a chilling reminder of how fragile our routines are. You step out of work, you follow the same path, you trust the same schedule. And yet, all it takes is one night, one shadowed figure, one broken camera, for everything to collapse. Lily's disappearance wasn't just a crime. It was an assault on the very idea of safety and routine. For her family, it was the shattering of a belief that repetition equals security. For her community, it was a wake-up call that even the most ordinary habits can mask extraordinary danger. That night, August 12th, 2005, left a scar on Philadelphia's memory. 20 minutes of silence, a city buzzing with life, and a young woman gone. And now, I want to hear from you. Would you feel safe walking this path at night? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the smallest choices carry the biggest consequences. From the moment the Hill family reported Lily missing, Philadelphia police moved quickly, at least by procedure. Within hours of the call, 3 detectives from the Special Victims Unit were dispatched to South Street. Their task was to reconstruct her final known moments, a task that began with voices of the people who saw her last. At the South Street diner, her co-workers repeated the same details. Lily had stayed late to help clean. She tied her brown hair back, tightened the strap of her canvas bag, and walked out around 11:30 p.m. She didn't linger. She didn't meet anyone. She simply followed her routine. One coworker remembered her smiling faintly as she said goodnight. Another noted how neat she always looked, even after a long shift. To the detectives, these details gave a clear picture of her last steps, but no hint of what came after. Next, they checked with the SEPTA bus driver who had pulled into Girard Avenue that night. He had no memory of Lily boarding. None of the passengers recalled her either. A middle-aged woman remembered a group of drunken young men in the back of the bus, but no tired diner waitress with a canvas bag. That absence weighed heavily. If Lily had not boarded, where had she gone? Detectives turned to surveillance cameras. This was 2005, and Philadelphia's transit system was supposed to have reliable monitoring. But when technicians pulled the footage, the investigators' hope collapsed. Several cameras near the Girard Avenue bus stop had been malfunctioning for weeks. Only one blurry still image at 11:44 p.m. showed a petite figure in light-colored clothing beneath a street lamp. It could have been Lily, but it was grainy, ghost-like, not definitive evidence. The failure of technology left detectives groping in the dark. As they canvassed the area, one field officer spotted something glinting near a parking lot adjacent to the bus stop. A small silver hoop earring lay in the dust. It was carefully bagged and logged. When shown to Lily's mother, she admitted Lily often wore earrings, but she couldn't confirm this one as hers. Friends were equally uncertain. Lily owned several similar pairs. The earring might have been hers, or it might have belonged to anyone passing through the crowded street. Still, in those first days, it was the only tangible piece of evidence. For investigators, the psychological pressure was mounting. They knew the first 48 hours of a missing person case are critical. Each hour that passed without answers meant Lily's chances of survival shrank. Detectives worked nearly without sleep, interviewing everyone they could: bus passengers, nearby shop owners, bartenders closing up late. The responses were frustratingly uniform. No one had seen or heard anything. In a city of over 1.5 million people, Lily had simply vanished into silence. The first round of suspicion turned toward those closest to her. Statistically, disappearances often involve intimate partners. Police questioned Lily's ex-boyfriend, a mechanic at a Kensington garage. He had dated her for almost a year before their breakup earlier that spring. On the night Lily vanished, he was clocked in at work for the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, surrounded by co-workers. His alibi was airtight. Detectives, though cautious, ruled him out. Attention then shifted to Lily's co-workers. Rumors surfaced that a few male employees had been interested in her, and some even joked about her neat, quiet charm. But timelines proved none of them were near Girard Avenue between 11:30 and 11:50 that night. One man left the diner hours earlier and was captured by a neighbor's security camera arriving at home. Another spent the evening with his girlfriend across town. None fit the crucial 20-minute window. As detectives checked names off their list, one name began surfacing repeatedly in conversations: Daniel Brooks. Brooks was a 32-year-old unemployed former construction worker who frequented the South Street diner. He rarely ordered more than a single cup of coffee, but he would linger for hours, watching people come and go. Several employees remembered his eyes following Lily across the room. His attempts to strike up conversations were met with polite rejection. Lily once told a close friend, "He makes me uneasy, but I don't want to be rude." 8. When police brought Brooks in for questioning 3 days after Lily disappeared, they found him eerily calm. Sitting in the sterile interview room, he admitted he knew Lily from the diner, but insisted there was nothing more. That night, he claimed he had been in Camden, New Jersey, drinking at a small bar near a friend's apartment. But when detectives followed up, no one at the bar remembered seeing him. The owner shrugged. The night had been busy. Without surveillance cameras to confirm, his alibi floated in uncertainty. Psychologically, Brooks projected a kind of manipulative composure. He didn't panic. He didn't stumble. He simply deflected with vague answers, as if daring investigators to catch him in a lie they couldn't prove. Detectives' instincts told them something was off. Yet, the law required evidence: DNA, a witness, a confession. None existed. Without hard proof, he couldn't be held. Days turned into weeks. Flyers with Lily's picture covered telephone poles and shop windows. Her family begged for tips. Her mother's tear-stained pleas aired on local TV. The hotline received dozens of calls, but none credible. Some were well-meaning guesses, others cruel pranks. The leads evaporated as quickly as they appeared. Inside the precinct, the frustration was suffocating. Detectives pored over the timeline again and again. 11:30, Lily leaves the diner. 11:45, taxi driver sees her under the street lamp. 11:50, the bus departs without her. Somewhere in those 20 minutes, she was taken. But without a body, without witnesses, the case was built on shadows. The silver earring sat sealed in evidence. The blurry camera image gathered dust in a file. Daniel Brooks's name lingered in reports, annotated with cautious phrases like person of interest and insufficient evidence. Investigators felt they were circling the truth but couldn't break through. By the fall of 2005, momentum stalled. The city moved on to other emergencies, other crimes demanding attention. For the Hill family, every day was agony. For the police, every dead end drained morale. The investigation had not been abandoned, but the energy that once fueled it faded into routine check-ins, cold phone calls, and unanswered leads. In internal reports, the words were stark. Case inconclusive. Possible abduction between South Street and Girard Avenue. Evidence insufficient. To the Hill family, those words were unbearable. To investigators, they were the bureaucratic end of a nightmare they couldn't solve. And to the city of Philadelphia, it was another file stacked on the shelf of unresolved tragedies. The case of Lily Grace Hill soon slipped into the archives of Philadelphia's cold case files, waiting for a new lead, a confession, or a technological breakthrough that might finally bring light into the 20-minute gap where a young woman disappeared forever. By the end of 2005, the Hill family had learned to live with the kind of silence that feels like a weight pressing against the walls of a home. The search for Lily had yielded no breakthroughs, no fresh tips, only frustration. Flyers once stapled to telephone poles were sun-bleached and peeling. The photo of a smiling young woman in a faded summer dress was now just another part of the city's background noise, a face people passed by without noticing. In August 2006, on the first anniversary of Lily's disappearance, the family organized a vigil at Holy Name Church in Fishtown. The turnout was overwhelming. Nearly 100 neighbors, friends, and even strangers crowded the church steps, candles flickering against the humid summer air. Prayers were whispered, and people shared stories of Lily's kindness, her dependability, her dreams. That night, the Hill family felt less alone, supported by a community unwilling to forget. But the following year, the crowd was smaller. By 2007, barely 30 people came. By 2008, only family, close friends, and a handful of volunteers remained. What had once been a collective outpouring of grief became a quiet circle of candles and silence. The psychology of grief is cruel. For families of the missing, hope never dies, but it does change shape. Linda Hill lit a candle for her daughter every night, even when no one else was watching. Her husband retreated into silence, his eyes distant, as if he were trying to imagine a world where Lily had simply never existed, because that was easier than facing her absence. Lily's brother carried guilt, replaying memories of teasing her about the canvas bag she always carried. He told himself, if I'd walked her home that night, maybe she'd still be here. Survivor's guilt gnawed at him, day after day. For the community, empathy gradually gave way to resignation. At first, neighbors rallied. Flyers were plastered in corner shops. Donation jars sat near cash registers to help fund the search. But as the years ticked by without progress, a darker sentiment settled in. Some quietly said, "This is unsolvable." Others avoided the topic altogether, as if silence would protect them from the reminder that danger could strike anyone. The media followed a similar trajectory. In the weeks after Lily vanished, local papers ran daily updates, chasing any scrap of information. Television crews interviewed detectives, neighbors, and family members. But as the investigation stalled, coverage dwindled. By 2007, Lily's name appeared only occasionally in roundups of missing persons, buried beneath headlines of newer, fresher tragedies. For journalists, a cold trail meant fading readership. For the Hills, it meant their daughter's story was slowly being erased. And here's where you must place yourself in their shoes. If it were your daughter's photo on those candles, would you stop believing or keep fighting? That question haunted the hills every day. Each August vigil became not only a memorial, but a test of endurance, a reminder that they were carrying a burden few could imagine. The dwindling attendance was not just numbers, it was the slow retreat of solidarity, leaving them more isolated with every passing year. Psychologically, the family began to fracture under the strain. Linda clung desperately to small rituals. She cooked Lily's favorite meals on birthdays, kept her room neat as though she might walk through the door at any moment, and wrote letters to her daughter she tucked away in a shoebox. These rituals were lifelines, fragile attempts to keep connection alive. Her husband, on the other hand, grew bitter. He stopped speaking openly about Lily, convinced that the more he said her name, the more it hurt. The tension between hope and despair widened into an unspoken rift at the dinner table. Outside the home, whispers about Lily faded. In Fishtown, neighbors who once stopped Linda in the grocery store to offer sympathy now avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with grief that had stretched too long. Children who had been in middle school when Lily disappeared grew into adults who only dimly remembered her case as something their parents once talked about. For detectives still assigned to the case, the psychological toll was equally heavy. Every few months, the file was reopened, a few leads re-examined, but nothing stuck. Officers rotated in and out of the cold case unit, and Lily's name was just one among dozens, her file gathering dust in the evidence room. For new detectives, it was a tragic story, but not a personal one. For veterans, it was a reminder of failure, a wound to professional pride they could not heal. The silver earring remained in storage, sealed in its evidence bag. The blurry still from the SEPTA camera sat in a file folder, its grainy pixels offering no new answers. And the name Daniel Brooks, the man whose presence had once unsettled Lily and drawn police suspicion, faded from conversation, unsupported by evidence. The case had become a ghost, an unsolved mystery the city didn't know how to confront. For the hills, Lily wasn't just another line in the cold case files. She was their world. Every candle lit, every flyer tacked to a wall, every whispered prayer was proof of their refusal to let her be forgotten. Yet, as the years stretched into more than a decade, their persistence was met with silence. The silence of a city too busy to care. The silence of a justice system without evidence. The silence of a world that seemed to have moved on. And yet, in that silence, the hills continued to speak Lily's name. They clung to the hope, faint, desperate, but still alive, that one day, the truth would emerge. They could not have known that hope would take more than a decade to be realized, or that it would come not through human memory, but through science. But in those long years of waiting, as candles burned lower and crowds dwindled, they proved something vital. Love does not fade, even when the world forgets. By 2018, 13 long years had passed since the night Lily Grace Hill vanished. Her case had become one of many unsolved tragedies resting quietly in the archives, collecting dust in Philadelphia's cold case files. For the Hill family, life had settled into an unbearable rhythm of unanswered questions and diminishing hope. Then, on an ordinary November morning, the silence was broken. A crew of city workers arrived at Pennypack Park, a sprawling stretch of woods and streams in northeast Philadelphia. The assignment was mundane. Replace old pipes running near an abandoned sewer line from the 1990s. Heavy machinery groaned as an excavator dug into the damp earth. The men expected only mud and rocks. Instead, the bucket scraped against something pale. At first, the operator thought it was animal bones. Deer remains were common in the park, but when one of his crew climbed down and brushed the dirt away, silence fell. The unmistakable shape of a human skull emerged, teeth still intact. The men froze. Tools dropped into the mud. One worker immediately dialed 911, his hands trembling. Within minutes, local patrol units arrived. The site was sealed with yellow police tape, and the crew stood back, shaken by the realization that they had stumbled upon something far darker than old pipes. Forensic technicians were summoned. Under the cold gray light of November, they laid out flood lamps and began the painstaking process of recovery. Slowly, they uncovered not just bones, but fragments of clothing. Worn denim jeans, seams still visible despite the years underground. A faded light blue shirt, its buttons half rusted away. Near the remains lay a dented silver heart-shaped necklace, tangled with mud and roots. And half buried in the soil was what looked like a shredded canvas bag, the zipper corroded with rust. The scene was hauntingly familiar to investigators who remembered Lily's file. A young woman missing since 2005, last seen wearing jeans, a blue shirt, carrying a canvas bag she never left behind. Murmurs spread quietly among the technicians. Could this be her? The discovery struck like lightning through the department. The bones and belongings were carefully bagged and labeled. Each piece of evidence was photographed in situ, then lifted with surgical precision. The skull and long bones were placed in padded containers. The necklace was sealed separately, its heart-shaped pendant dulled by time. Soil samples were gathered, cataloged, and stored. Even the remnants of the bag were preserved, though the fabric nearly disintegrated on contact. That night, detectives made their way to the Hill family's modest apartment in Fishtown. When Linda Hill opened the door, she knew instantly that something was different. The officers weren't there to ask questions. They had come to deliver news. Sitting at the kitchen table, Linda clutched her eldest son's hand as the detectives explained what city workers had found in Pennypack Park. Human remains. Clothing that matched Lily's description. A necklace. A canvas bag. Linda's face went pale, her breath shallow. For 13 years she had imagined her daughter alive somewhere, clinging to the fragile possibility of a return. Now, the words collapsed that hope in an instant. Her husband sat silently, eyes red and unfocused. Lily's brother broke down, whispering through tears. "She's coming back to us, but not the way we wanted." AIDS. Psychologically, the discovery reopened wounds the family had spent years trying to scar over. Grief that had dulled into resignation roared back like it was the first day all over again. For years, the absence of answers had allowed denial to survive in small doses. But bones in the dirt left no room for denial. Lily was gone, and she had been gone all along. Meanwhile, forensic anthropologists at the Philadelphia Crime Lab began their meticulous work. They arranged the bones on a stainless steel table, measuring each fragment. The pelvis and skull indicated a female. The estimated height, based on long bones, fell between 5'5" and 5'7", consistent with Lily's 5'6" stature. The teeth showed an age range of mid-20s to early 30s. Decomposition and soil analysis suggested the remains had been buried for over a decade. Every detail aligned with the 2005 disappearance. Still, science demanded confirmation. Samples were taken from a molar and femur to extract DNA. The items of clothing were logged for textile analysis. The silver necklace was preserved, the dent in its pendant carefully noted. Even the corroded bag was salvaged as much as possible. Forensics moved slowly, carefully, knowing that after 13 years, these fragile items might hold the only path to truth. As the news spread, the community was jolted awake. Pennypack Park, usually a place for joggers and picnics, became a crime scene watched by curious neighbors. Local headlines ran bold print. Human remains found in Pennypack Park, possible link to 2005 disappearance. Reporters rushed to the site, cameras flashing behind the police tape. Residents whispered to one another in shock. Many hadn't thought of Lily in years, but the discovery reignited memories of the young woman who had vanished without a trace. For those who had once attended her vigils, the news was devastating, but strangely affirming. She hadn't simply disappeared into thin air. She had been here, in the soil of Philadelphia, waiting to be found. Inside the Hill home, grief mixed with grim relief. For years, Linda had prayed for answers, any answers. Now she had them, but the answer was death. She placed her hand on her daughter's framed photo, tears streaming, whispering, "You've come back to us." The cruelest part was knowing Lily had been so close all along, hidden beneath the city's earth while life carried on above. Psychologically, the shock of reopening wounds after 13 years cannot be overstated. For the Hills, it was as though time folded in on itself, dragging them back to 2005. They relived the phone call from Lily's roommate, the unanswered questions, the empty bed. Only now, the uncertainty was replaced by the brutal certainty of death. Detectives, too, felt the weight. For many in the department, Lily's file had been an open sore, a young woman lost, a case they could not crack. Now, with tangible remains in hand, they had a second chance. It was as though a long-dormant entry in the cold case files suddenly came alive. And that changed everything. The discovery transformed Lily's case from a missing person file into a homicide investigation. It meant revisiting old leads, dusting off reports, and once again looking hard at the people who had crossed her path that night. For detectives who had once faced only shadows, the bones, clothing, and necklace were physical anchors. Proof. Evidence. The chance to do what they couldn't 13 years earlier, pursue justice with something solid in their hands. For the Hill family, the vigil that year felt different. Candles still flickered, but this time they were no longer prayers for a safe return. They were memorials, farewells, acknowledgments of a truth no parent should have to face. The community turnout was larger than it had been in years, as neighbors who once drifted away now returned, drawn by the gravity of the discovery. People who had nearly forgotten Lily's story gathered once again, whispering her name, shaken by the realization that she had been beneath their city the whole time. For Philadelphia, the Pennypack Park discovery was a grim reminder that the past refuses to stay buried. Stories like this show how the past refuses to stay buried. Subscribe to see more unraveling of America's darkest secrets. The discovery of Lily Grace Hill's remains in Pennypack Park reignited the case with a force no one expected. For 13 years, investigators had lived with dead ends. Now, they had bones, clothing, and the chance to apply technology that hadn't existed in 2005. The cold case unit knew this was their moment. The faded blue shirt Lily wore that night became the centerpiece. Under fluorescent lights in the lab, forensic specialists examined its fabric, scanning with ultraviolet fluorescence to detect microscopic biological traces invisible to the naked eye. Hours of searching revealed faint smudges near the collar and shoulder, residues overlooked by older technology. With delicate hands, technicians extracted epithelial cells, careful not to damage the fragile fibers. The sample was sent to Parabon Nanolabs, a pioneer in forensic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA testing, which requires direct comparison with a known suspect, genealogical DNA can link samples to entire family trees. The process involves sequencing hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, then comparing them against massive public databases where millions of Americans voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to trace ancestry. Months later, a detailed report returned to Philadelphia. Nearly 100 pages of charts, family trees, and probability graphs. The conclusion was chillingly clear. The DNA trace on Lily's shirt was tied to the Brooks lineage. Daniel Brooks. The name that had once been scribbled in the margins of police notes in 2005, a man dismissed for lack of evidence, now resurfaced with scientific weight. Investigators pored over the report. It didn't just identify a genetic line, it narrowed the possibilities to fewer than a dozen individuals. But one stood out. Daniel Brooks, 32 years old at the time of Lily's disappearance, unemployed, known for loitering at the diner where she worked, remembered for the unsettling way he stared at her. Witnesses recalled Lily confiding, "He makes me uneasy." Eights. This time, the unease became evidence. The cold case team reopened Brooks's old file. Buried within were overlooked details. A 2003 complaint from a convenience store employee who said Brooks followed her to her car. A 2004 neighbor's report that he often stared at young women passing by his house. Small incidents, never prosecuted, but together painting a troubling portrait of obsession. In 2005, when Lily vanished, Brooks claimed he was drinking at a bar in Camden. But no one corroborated it. No receipts, no witnesses. Police questioned him briefly, then let him go, their hands tied without physical proof. Now, the genealogy data changed everything. And here is where you, as the viewer, feel the power of modern science. You realize a single cell, invisible to the eye, can topple a man's lies built over 17 years. Psychology became a crucial part of reconstructing the story. Daniel Brooks wasn't just unlucky to have his DNA turn up. He had been circling Lily for months before her disappearance. Profiles of men like Brooks show a dangerous blend. Social isolation, resentment, and fixation on women who reject them. Neighbors described him as quiet, almost invisible. He lived alone in a shabby Camden apartment, worked odd construction jobs when he could get them, and spent long stretches sitting in diners nursing a single cup of coffee. That loneliness, untempered by healthy relationships, hardened into obsession. When Lily served him, polite but distant, he misread it as attention. When she avoided his small talk, he grew more determined. Psychologists studying predatory behavior note how such men often escalate when rejected. What begins as staring or lingering can tip into confrontation, and from confrontation into violence. For Lily, her instinct was to downplay it. Friends said she brushed it off. He's just a little weird, but harmless. But her unease revealed she sensed the threat beneath his calm exterior. To investigators re-examining Brooks through this psychological lens, the pieces aligned. His pattern of behavior, his proximity to the diner, his unverified alibi, and now the genealogical DNA, all pointed to him as the predator who had lurked in plain sight. The Parabon report was groundbreaking, but it was not enough on its own. Genealogical DNA could point to a family, but the law required a one-to-one match to convict. Prosecutors reminded detectives, "This is powerful, but it's not the finish line. We need Brooks's direct DNA." Eights. The cold case unit launched a covert surveillance operation. They tailed Brooks quietly, documenting his routines. He still lived in Camden, drove a battered pickup, worked sporadically at small construction sites. Evenings, he often stopped at a local bar for a beer, sitting alone. Weekends, he visited his mother in New Jersey, buying groceries on the way. Detectives watched and waited, searching for opportunities. Discarded cigarette butts, beer cans, coffee cups, anything he touched could yield the direct DNA sample they needed. All the while, they carried the weight of history. This was the same man who had slipped through their fingers in 2005. The thought that he had lived free for over a decade while Lily lay hidden in Pennypack Park gnawed at them. One detective admitted in his notes, "It feels like chasing a ghost we should have caught years ago." As surveillance tightened, the Hill family was briefed only in the vaguest terms. Detectives told them progress was being made, but details had to remain confidential. Linda Hill listened quietly, tears brimming, as she was told, "We believe we're closer than ever." Psychologically, this stage was torturous for the family. Hope and dread clashed inside them. For 13 years they had begged for answers. Now, answers seemed near, but those answers would mean facing the man responsible. Meanwhile, the prosecution strategy took shape. They combed through Lily's old case file, reconstructing the timeline with fresh eyes. 11:30 p.m. Lily leaves the diner. 11:45 p.m. Last seen at the Girard Avenue bus stop. Around midnight, her phone signal dies. Witnesses recall a tall man in dark clothing speaking to her. In 2005, too vague to pursue. In 2018, with genealogical DNA, it matched Brooks's profile perfectly. The psychological picture was equally compelling. Brooks had been rejected by Lily. His quiet demeanor masked loneliness that had soured into resentment. On that sweltering August night, rejection may have tipped him into rage. Abduction and concealment of her body became acts of control, one last assertion of power in a life otherwise marked by a failure. Investigators knew the case against Brooks was becoming more than circumstantial. They had science, psychology, and a narrative. What they needed now was irrefutable proof. The Parabon report concluded with a line that became their guiding star. Without modern genealogy, this would still sit buried in the cold case files. That sentence struck detectives hard. For over a decade, the case had seemed unsolvable. Yet here it was, science offering not just a clue, but a spotlight. All that remained was to capture Brooks's DNA directly and close the circle. In the spring of 2019, surveillance finally paid off. After an evening at his usual Camden bar, Brooks stepped outside for a smoke. Undercover officers watched from across the street as he flicked a cigarette butt into a public trash bin. Within minutes, a plainclothes detective posing as a sanitation worker retrieved the bag. The butt was sealed, logged, and rushed to the lab. Days later, a second sample was collected, a beer can he discarded near a job site. Each item was tagged, time-stamped, and placed in cold storage. Chain of custody was airtight. As the samples reached the lab, the cold case team held their breath. If the DNA matched the trace from Lily's shirt, the case would transform from suspicion to certainty. Detectives gathered in the sterile glow of the forensics unit, hearts pounding as sequencers ran their cycles. Hours turned into days. Finally, the report arrived. A perfect match. The DNA from Brooks's discarded cigarette butt matched the DNA on Lily's shirt with astronomical certainty. A 1 in 6. 8 trillion chance of error. Not a lineage, not a family. Him, Daniel Brooks. The cold case detectives stared at the report in silence. Some felt relief, others anger. One whispered, "He lived free for 14 years while she lay in the ground." Another clenched his jaw, muttering, "Not anymore." For prosecutors, this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The science was solid. The psychology added weight. The timeline connected every dot. Now, it was no longer about suspicion. It was about justice. And for the Hill family, still lighting candles in their apartment, the news carried a grim promise. The man who haunted their nightmares for nearly 2 decades was finally within reach. The genealogical report had put Daniel Brooks squarely back in the spotlight, but the law demanded precision. The cold case unit couldn't bring him into court with family line probabilities. They needed his DNA, direct and undeniable, to anchor the case. And so began one of the most careful surveillance operations in Philadelphia's recent history. For weeks, Brooks was shadowed quietly through his routines. Unmarked cars rotated shifts, ensuring he never noticed he was being watched. In the mornings, detectives tracked his battered blue pickup as it rattled toward small construction sites in Camden. At noon, they noted him eating alone, smoking in the same quiet corner by a convenience store. In the evenings, he drove to a dim neighborhood bar, ordered a cheap beer, and lingered on a stool by himself. The goal wasn't to confront him, not yet. It was to wait. Wait until he slipped, until he discarded something he touched, something carrying his DNA. One evening, Brooks walked out of the bar just before 9. 0p. M. Cigarette dangling from his lips. He smoked slowly, gazing into the night, then flicked the butt into a public trash can. Detectives moved quickly. A plainclothes officer, posing as sanitation staff, retrieved the bag within minutes. The cigarette butt was sealed in an evidence tube, labeled, logged, and transported under strict chain of custody. Days later, another opportunity arrived. At a job site, Brooks finished a can of cheap beer, crushed it casually, and tossed it into a plastic bin. The surveillance team pounced again, recovering the can as soon as he left. Another DNA-rich sample, another potential nail in the coffin. Each item was collected with meticulous detail. Chain of custody forms were signed, timestamps recorded, photographs taken. Detectives understood that a single misstep could give defense attorneys ammunition. They weren't just chasing evidence. They were building an unbreakable case. In the lab, the tension was electric. Technicians swabbed the cigarette filters, rinsed the rim of the beer can, and extracted cellular material. The profiles were uploaded into the system, waiting to be compared against the DNA sample from Lily's faded blue shirt, recovered at Pennypack Park. Detectives who had waited over a decade paced the halls outside, sipping coffee they barely tasted. Some closed their eyes, silently replaying the image of Lily's photo from old case files. One young detective whispered, "If this matches, 17 years of waiting ends tonight." 8s. The machines hummed, sequencers flickered, and after long hours the results emerged. A perfect match. The DNA from Brooks's discarded cigarette and beer can match the DNA from Lily's shirt with astronomical certainty. A 1 in 6. 8 trillion chance of error. In statistical terms, it was equivalent to certainty itself. For the detectives, the weight of that number was overwhelming. Relief, anger, vindication, emotions swirled all at once. One officer muttered under his breath, "He lived free all these years while she lay in the dirt." Another clenched his jaw, finally exhaling after years of frustration. Not anymore. 8s. For the Hill family, the call came late in the evening. Detectives explained carefully, almost reverently. The DNA from Lily's clothing had been matched directly to Daniel Brooks. After 13 years of silence, they now knew who was responsible. The family's reaction was complicated, raw, almost unbearable to witness. Linda Hill sobbed uncontrollably, both devastated and strangely relieved. "We begged for answers," she whispered. "Now we finally have them, but it hurts more than I ever imagined." Her son gripped her hand, tears streaming down his face, whispering, "At least now we can fight for her." Eights, psychologically, this was the cruel paradox of justice delayed. Certainty brought validation, no more guessing, no more unanswered questions. But it also stripped away the last refuge of denial. For years, some part of the hills had clung to the fantasy that Lily might be alive somewhere. Now, that hope was gone forever. All that remained was the certainty of her death and the face of her killer. For detectives, though, the DNA match was the holy grail. It turned an old suspicion into proof. Daniel Brooks was no longer a person of interest. He was the prime suspect, his guilt etched into the strands of DNA he carelessly discarded into a trash can. The cold case unit gathered that night in their office. The report lay open on the table, its numbers glowing under fluorescent light. One detective tapped the page, repeating the figure softly. 1 in 6. 8 trillion. Another closed her eyes, thinking of the Hill family's vigil candles burning year after year. For her, the match wasn't just data, it was a promise finally fulfilled. They documented everything in precise language, knowing prosecutors would need airtight evidence for trial. Chain of custody was verified twice, signatures cross-checked, timestamps logged to the minute. Nothing could be left vulnerable to challenge. Outside the lab, news of the match was kept confidential. Only a small circle knew the truth. But within that circle, the mood was heavy with a mix of triumph and gravity. They had cracked a mystery that haunted Philadelphia for nearly 2 decades. And here, you as the viewer must reflect. Justice often moves painfully slow. But when it arrives with certainty. That cigarette butt in a trash can was enough to undo years of denial and lies. A single careless moment brought the truth roaring back to life. Detectives knew the next steps would be decisive. Securing an arrest warrant, planning the takedown, preparing for trial. But for a brief moment, they allowed themselves to feel it, the weight of 17 years lifting, if only slightly. The Hill family lit their candles that night as they always had, but this time the flame carried new meaning. Not just remembrance, but proof that Lily's voice, silenced for so long, had finally been heard. Share this story. It proves even the oldest cold case files can be cracked wide open. The DNA match had given detectives what they had waited for since 2005. Now, it was time to move. On a cold March morning in 2022, unmarked vehicles lined a quiet street in Camden, New Jersey. At precisely 6:12 a.m., officers from Philadelphia PD, Camden County deputies, and an FBI support unit moved in. A battering knock on the door shattered the early stillness. "Police! Federal warrant!" they shouted. Inside, Daniel Brooks stumbled from his bedroom, half-dressed in pajama pants and a gray sweater. For a moment, his eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape. But within seconds, he was restrained, wrists cuffed behind his back, the weight of 17 years finally pressing down. Neighbors spilled out in disbelief, smay bathrobes and slippers on, whispering to each other. Daniel? Really? He was so quiet. He helped carry groceries. He sat in church pews. Phones rose to capture video as flashing red and blue lights painted the dawn. Within hours, headlines ran across Philadelphia and beyond. Camden man arrested in connection to 2005, cold case murder of Lily Grace Hill. For the Hills, the sight of Brooks led away in handcuffs was a gut punch of both grief and grim satisfaction. "That's the man," Lily's brother whispered, voice shaking. "That's the man who stole her from us." At headquarters, Brooks sat in a stark interrogation room. Fluorescent lights glared against the metal table, reflecting the pale skin of a man who had lived two lives: the quiet neighbor and the suspected predator. Two seasoned detectives entered, their tone calm but direct. At first, Brooks was defiant. "I don't know her," he said sharply, gesturing at a photo of Lily in her diner uniform. His voice carried the false confidence of a man used to slipping away. But when confronted with the DNA report, his facade cracked. His eyes lingered too long on the words match probability. 1 in 6, 8 trillion. He froze, then mumbled, "Maybe I brushed against her at the diner." Moments later, he contradicted himself, claiming he had never met her outside. Detectives noted every shift, every inconsistency. One leaned forward, voice cold. "First you said you never knew her. Then you say maybe you touched her. Which is it, Daniel?" Brooks clenched his fists, jaw tight, but offered no clear answer. His silence was louder than words. To investigators, the interrogation confirmed what the DNA had already shouted. Daniel Brooks had been there, with Lily, on the night she vanished. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors built their narrative piece by piece. The DNA was their cornerstone, but they wanted more. That's when an old witness statement resurfaced. Margaret Lewis, a retired nurse, had lived near the Girard Avenue bus stop in 2005. Her 17-year-old recollection noted seeing a young woman in jeans and a light shirt arguing with a tall man. At the time, police had dismissed it, too vague, too little support. But when investigators tracked her down in 2022, she recalled it vividly. She looked uneasy. He was pressing closer, and she shook her head, like she wanted to get away. "Eight's shown a lineup," Margaret pointed to Brooks. "That's him. The way he leaned in, the way he blocked her. I remember it." Eight's. Her testimony became the human link to the science, a living voice tying Brooks to Lily's final minutes. The courtroom battle began in September 2022, one of Philadelphia's most watched trials in years. Reporters filled the aisles, sketch artists hunched over pads, and citizens lined the benches, hungry for resolution after nearly 2 decades. Brooks entered in an orange jumpsuit, thinner and grayer than he had been in 2005. His eyes stayed down, rarely meeting the jury's gaze. Prosecutors opened forcefully. "We have an absolute DNA match between Daniel Brooks and the victim's clothing. We have an eyewitness who saw him confront her. And we have a timeline that rules out all other possibilities. This is not coincidence. This is murder." Eights. The defense countered with skepticism. "Ladies and gentlemen, DNA can degrade. Fabric buried in the ground for over a decade can be contaminated. And memories after 17 years? They blur. You cannot convict a man on faint traces and fading recollections." Eights. It was a battle of psychology as much as law. The defense sowed seeds of doubt, while prosecutors hammered certainty. This is where you enter the story. You sit in the jury box, and the evidence is in your hands. Will you believe the science or the silence? The prosecution reminded jurors that this wasn't just data. It was one of America's cold case files brought to life. They displayed the chain of custody, showing how Brooks's discarded cigarette and beer can had been collected, sealed, and tested. They projected the DNA report on a large screen, the 1 in 6, 8 trillion probability glowing under courtroom lights. Then came Margaret Lewis. Her voice trembled as she described that humid night in 2005, seeing a young woman shrink back under a street lamp as a man leaned too close. "I thought they were a couple fighting," she said softly. But the next morning, When I heard Lily was missing, I knew it was something worse. 8. The jury listened intently. Science gave them certainty. Margaret gave them humanity. Together, the narrative closed like a vice around Brooks. The Hills sat in the front row every day. Linda's hair had gone gray, her face lined with years of grief, but her presence was unshakable. She stared at Brooks, eyes burning with both sorrow and resolve. Her son clenched his fists under the table, forced to sit only feet away from the man accused of stealing his sister's life. For jurors, this silent confrontation was a constant reminder. Behind every chart and testimony was a family who had lived 17 years of agony. Closing arguments cut like knives. The defense insisted, doubt remains. 17 years is too long. You cannot know what really happened. 8. The prosecution thundered back. 17 years is not too long for truth. The DNA does not forget. The witness does not forget. And the ground in Pennypack Park did not forget. Daniel Brooks chose to take Lily Grace Hill's life and bury her in silence. Today, you choose whether justice finally speaks. 8. The jury retired for deliberation. In that small room, the weight of 17 years pressed heavy. Some jurors hesitated, wondering if the defense had a point about contamination or memory. But as they reviewed the DNA charts, the chain of custody, and Margaret's testimony, hesitation gave way to clarity. Psychologically, the deliberation was a battlefield of conscience. Jurors wrestled with the fear of condemning an innocent man versus the moral weight of freeing a guilty one. Slowly, they leaned toward the evidence, the science, the consistency of the story. After 3 days, the foreperson stood in court, voice steady. We find the defendant, Daniel Brooks, guilty of first-degree murder. 8. The Hills collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing. Linda whispered, "Justice. Lily, justice." Brooks sat frozen, face drained of expression, his long silence finally broken by the gavel's echo. The words rang through the courtroom. Guilty of first-degree murder. 8. Daniel Brooks sat motionless, his face drained, as if the years of silence had collapsed in a single instant. The judge's gavel struck, sentencing him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Hill family, that sound was both an ending and a beginning. Linda Hill wept openly, clutching her son's hand. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Justice, Lily." After all these years, justice. Her eldest son nodded through tears, knowing their 17-year nightmare had finally reached its conclusion. Psychologically, the moment was catharsis in its truest sense. Grief did not vanish, it never could, but it was now tempered by justice. For years, the Hills carried unanswered questions like chains around their necks. Now, those chains had broken, replaced by the solemn knowledge that their daughter's killer would never harm another soul. The community, too, felt the weight lift. At the annual vigil in Fishtown that autumn, the candles burned brighter than they had in years. Neighbors who had stopped coming returned, moved by the story's resolution. Lily's photo stood at the center, surrounded by flowers and candlelight, not just a symbol of loss, but of persistence. Children who once heard her name only in whispers now heard it spoken with respect. And here, you place yourself in that moment. You hear the gavel fall and realize justice may sleep for years, but it never dies. The case of Lily Grace Hill became more than a tragedy. It became a lesson written into the heart of Philadelphia. Detectives learned that no witness statement, no fragment of evidence, should ever be dismissed. Families learned that even when hope fades, persistence can reignite it. communities learned that silence does not erase the past. It only delays the truth. Prosecutors reminded the jury and the nation that this wasn't just data on a chart. This was one of America's cold case files brought to life. And for the families of other cold case files still waiting in the shadows, Lily's case proved that persistence in science can deliver answers, even after decades. At her grave, white flowers were laid, a note resting beside them. Justice has come. You are not forgotten. Join us for more journeys through America's most haunting cold case files. Subscribe, share, and keep these stories alive, because every forgotten case deserves a voice, and every silent victim deserves the light of truth.